talking to Dr. David Morgenroth, MD. David is a physician scientist and professor at the University of Washington's Department of Rehabilitation Medicine, serving as vice chair for research. He is a core investigator at the VA Center for Limb Loss and Mobility, affectionately known as CLIMB, and associate director of the Amputation Rehabilitation Fellowship at the VA Puget Sound Healthcare System. His research, which has attracted over $12 million as a PI and $30 million as a co-investigator, focuses on enhancing mobility and quality of life for individuals with limb loss. An educator and mentor, he has received several national awards, including the American Academy of Orthotists and Prosthetists Honorary Lifetime Membership Award, the Howard R. Trainhart Lecture Award, and the American Association of Academic Physiatrists Early Career Academician Award. He serves on editorial and advisory boards and has led strategic planning initiatives at the University of Washington and the Association of Academic Physiatrists. Welcome, David. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Josh. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So I wanted to start us off with you telling us a little bit about why you love working at the VA so much. I know this is, a central tenet of your career.
It is. And I think serendipity has played a large role, an oversized role in my career. I think there are some individuals who, after they finish their training, they choose a VA career. And I wasn't one of those. So I sort of happened upon the VA in that when I was doing my residency training, I was working with Dr. Joe Chernicki, who became my mentor, and he was at the VA, and he really inspired me both as a physician and as a scientist focused on limb loss rehabilitation. And so working with Joe, I decided to apply for NIH-funded K-12 grant, which is also a 3-year fellowship through the Rehabilitation Medicine Scientist Training Program. And in order to do that, I had to choose a mentor, and so I chose working with Joe, and that meant that I was going to be working at the VA. So it's something that just sort of happened, but I'm incredibly grateful that it did happen because I've now been at the VA since I finished my residency training for 17 years, and it's been an incredibly rewarding career. I think some of the reasons I've really appreciated working in the VA is, while some come from a military background and feel a great desire to give back to veterans because of either their own or maybe their family's military background, I don't have that for myself or my family, but I've come to really appreciate the role of giving back to veterans who've served our country. And I've also really appreciated, as a clinician, the way one can practice a very thorough version of medicine within the VA. So outside of the VA, what they call the civilian sector here in the VA, there tends to be more focus on efficiency, since healthcare is it is a business in this country. It's, or at least primarily, run like a business, and what that means is that there has to be some sense of efficiency in order to make financial ends meet for reimbursement reasons and such. So what that means is there has to be some limitations in how much time clinicians have to care for patients, typically in the civilian sector. Now, the same is to some extent true in the VA, but we tend to have a little more time, and especially when we're dealing with patients with a lot of medical comorbidities or psychosocial complications, things that really require a very sort of time-intensive approach to ensure that we're offering optimal care. So that's one thing I've really appreciated, is I have the time it takes that I think I need to care for some of these especially complex patients. Then another thing I've really appreciated is within the VA, I don't have to fight with insurance companies for reimbursement. So if I'm prescribing a prosthesis, I can entirely think about what is going to be the optimal prosthesis for this individual and what is going to help them the most without worrying that it's going to get denied by insurance. Or if I have an individual who loves to do a specific activity that a daily use limb is not feasible for or not optimal for enabling, then I can prescribe a second limb to enable them to achieve that particular functional goal. So those are some of the things I really appreciate on the clinical side. On the research side, one thing that is great about working in the VA is we have an intramural grant funding agency. So the VA funds grants, and those are it's an intramural program in that the only people who can be PI on those grants are people within the VA, or at least folks who have a greater than 5/8 or greater appointment. Not sure why the VA uses eighths, but anyway. And as a rehabilitation scientist, the VA puts a lot of resources towards rehabilitation research. So while at NIH, there isn't, of the 20 or so institutes, there isn't even one that is focused entirely on rehab. There is the NCMR, which is within an institute. Compared to that, the VA has one of the 4 divisions of research is focused on rehabilitation. So the Rehabilitation Research and Development, which is now actually changing its name as the VA is going through some reorganization on the research side. So those are just some examples of why I've really appreciated a VA career.
I wanted to give a shout out to a podcast that I recently listened to called Standing Ready, featuring VA staff members Fred Downs and Glenn Clutie, which for me was really helpful in putting both the clinical and research aspects of prosthetics into a historical context, going all the way back to the Civil War. I think for me, prosthetics is kind of a microcosm of how in the U.S. We fund and manage innovation that has an element of societal good. Where on the one hand, these products are being sold in a highly competitive for-profit healthcare environment, but then at the same time, we have the federal government investing in the next wave of technologies, and I think in prosthetics, that has been crucial to unlocking some of the big leaps forward in the prosthetics industry. So we as a for-profit business, of course, have really enjoyed the federal government's willingness to invest and collaborate with small businesses in this way.
Yeah, absolutely, Josh. I think, first of all, I think partnerships between the government and private entities and for-profit entities, it's vital. I think, if you think about government agencies, universities and academic institutions, and then industry, I think they all have an important role to play. They all have different strengths, different restrictions, and different abilities. And I think we all need each other, which is, one of the reasons I've really enjoyed our collaboration between our team here at the VA, some of the folks on the university side, and Humotech. And, an additional thought, because I'm sure we'll want to dive into that a bit too, but I'm listening to Tony Fauci's memoir right now, the audiobook version, and it's a lot of fun. He's Dr. Fauci is actually reading it himself, so I get to thoroughly enjoy his Brooklyn accent, which as a New Yorker, I really appreciate. And one of the parts I was not necessarily surprised by, but really enticed by was the portion where he's talking about in his role as director of NIAID within National Institutes of Health, where he's talking about the importance of the relationship between who NIAID funds, the intramural program, and the pharmaceutical industry. And when it comes to, for instance, producing vaccines, the government can't do that by itself. It needs the pharmaceutical industry. And the pharmaceutical industry, on the other hand, they're very good at making vaccines, but there needs to be funding for research and development and partnership with government agencies to ensure it's being utilized in the optimal manner. So it was just sort of a really interesting example and how that plays out when we have a pandemic, for instance. So bigger picture perhaps than the field of prosthetics, but I think similar in that industry has certain attributes that are absolutely vital, and these partnerships I think can be really fruitful and can lead to high impact for the end users, the people who need either the device or the pharmaceutical or the vaccine, et cetera.
Absolutely. On the other hand, one challenge that I hear about sometimes from people in the field is that the great innovations coming out of the VA don't always translate so easily into the civilian sector, because as you described towards the introduction, they are in some ways very different worlds. So I wonder if you can pontificate on that a little bit. How do we start to maybe see some more translation between these worlds?
Yeah, good question. I think whenever you're, as a researcher, you're considering a study of any kind, you're thinking, you have this balance you have to strike between methodological control, which comes, for instance, in the form of participant selection. So if you just have any old people with any attributes or any characteristics come into a study, then you end up potentially with more confounding variables. So many studies, especially in prosthetics, let's say, tend to want to try and have methodological controls in participant selection. So for instance, maybe you say, well, we want folks who are active and what are considered K3 or K4 type of ambulators. Now, that is good for methodological control, but it is not so good for being able to then apply those findings to a more heterogeneous population. So, for instance, to the dysvascular diabetic portion of the amputee population who tends to be more maybe along the lines of the K2 ambulators or even K1. So whereas if you include all comers, then it can be more challenging. So I bring this up because if a VA scientist is only studying a VA population, you have to consider, if you're going to apply either the innovation or the research findings, you have to consider how there may be differences between that veteran population and the civilian population. Now, in some ways there may be minimal differences, but in other ways there may be pertinent differences that could be confounding and could mean that you can't apply those same results or that same innovation in the same way. The other thing to consider is on the implementation science side of the equation is the VA is a very different system than either academic medical centers or certainly private practice type settings. And from an implementation standpoint, that has substantial implications as to how you might implement an innovation, how you might implement a research finding, a shared decision-making model, etc., different medical record systems, different reimbursement systems, different types of insurance that providers are having to deal with for their patients, different metrics of success even, and different restrictions on the way care is provided. So I think both of those are important elements to consider when researchers or innovators are considering wider applications of their research or their innovations.
Yeah, I wish I had thought more explicitly about these things early in my journey in prosthetics. You know, I came into this field bright-eyed and bushy-tailed about, you know, inventing some new kind of robot foot. And, you know, was learning the hard way, talking to patients, talking to prosthetists, talking to physiatrists, about how they do and don't, you know, try new things, that I learned, holy cow, there are a lot of barriers to innovation in this space. You know, this idea of implementation science is one that it would be great if our, you know, the funding agencies would start to position as front and center. Maybe the, you know, the kind of next generation of innovative projects in this area will have to write a page on how, you know, they've studied the market and the path to implementation. You know, these problems are typically left for the private sector to figure out. But in my experience in this field, it's not the best strategy because it's quite complex and challenging. So if you're an investor that has $1 million to invest, why would you invest it here when you can invest it somewhere else where implementation is sort of a less difficult endeavor? So I do think we need some dedicated focus on this matter of implementation.
Yeah, I agree. And, you know, I think what implementation scientists will tell you is that implementation science should be considered throughout the process, even from the early discovery phase of the process, in order to enhance the likelihood of having an impact with one's innovation or research. I think the funding agencies are trying to keep this in mind. I mean, I know that the VA is extremely interested in the downstream impact on veterans. Now, where the rubber meets the road, it might be a little more challenging to figure out how to fund some of these implementation-oriented projects. But we've seen examples that have been successful in that regard. And you know, I know you're in the prosthetics innovation space, but the example I'll give is some of our CLIMB colleagues here, Dan Norvell, who's a PhD epidemiologist, Allison Henderson, and actually now Beth Halsney and I have been more recently collaborating with them. But they, in working closely with Joe Chernicke, my former mentor, they had worked for years on an amputation level decision-making aid. And so they started off with predictors and prediction calculators. So to be able to say, well, when someone needs an amputation, someone with a dysvascular etiology, how do you figure out what's the best level? So, you know, a transmetatarsal, a transtibial, transfemoral, you have all these different factors that you have to weigh in on. You have to think about mortality. You have to think about reamputation rates or the likelihood of reamputation at a given level. You have to think about the functional implications. So what's the likely level of mobility at each of those levels? And so they started off by essentially figuring out, okay, well, how can we put together a calculator with all these risk predictors? And then they moved beyond that towards the shared decision making, and they've essentially achieved implementation. So this is something I've used in my this risk calculator I've used in my clinical practice. And so it's not a prosthetic innovation, but it is certainly an IP innovation, and one that has, I think, really helped to move us towards shared decision making, to be able to share this with patients who are going to undergo an amputation, and with our surgeons who we work closely with, to say, okay, well, yes, a transmetatarsal might enable a higher likelihood of mobility, but at the same time, your risk of reamputation in this individual is through the roof. And you have to consider that, and actually, you have to consider the mortality differences if you were going to go at a more proximal level. And what that allows you to do is then go to the patient and say, hey, what are your priorities here? Is it to really try for mobility at the most distal level, even though there's a decent likelihood that you're going to have a more proximal amputation because it's not going to heal? Or are you someone who really just wants one surgery and you want to make sure that's the definitive surgery, even if it means your mobility might be more likely impaired and you might more likely be in a wheelchair, let's say. So I use that as an example where they were able to get funding for, from sort of the early phases of that research through implementation. So it is certainly possible. Now, in the prosthetic space, there's some additional challenges, for instance, on the reimbursement side with L codes and whatnot. So I think that lends towards the challenge that you're mentioning as far as a company that is trying to innovate in the prosthetic space. How do you overcome those challenges? And we're
working on it.
Yeah, I know it's not easy.
Your example is fascinating. I think it's an example of how we're clearly at the dawn of a new era where data is going to be used to inform decision making in powerful ways. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on how this tool works? Because I think it'll be interesting to listeners, and I'd love to see a demo at some point.
Sure. And I would actually encourage you to, at some point, have maybe, Dan Norvell on the podcast if you really want to deep dive into this. I'm probably going to do it a bit of a disservice, whereas Dan, I think, could pontificate more in greater detail. And but I'll tell you about, for instance, in my experience using it as a clinician. So what the original form of this would mean was I would need to pull some information from the medical record on the patient. So let's say I'm on the consult service where the vascular surgeons are consulting me about a veteran who has a diabetic foot wound, not healing, maybe has a cellulitis and is going to need to undergo amputation. And they have the question of, okay, what are the implications of the different levels of amputation? Can we consider a TMA versus a transtibial, or should we think about a transfemoral amputation? And so what I'm doing is I'm still doing my comprehensive history and physical exam with the patient, but I'm also looking at some of these other factors that have been shown to be predictors through Dan and Joe and Allison's research. And I am then entering, there's a website you can go to with this the AMPREDICT calculator, and then you're entering these different variables where it gives you the prompts. And some of them in the original version were you had to actually ask the patient, so you can't just pull all of them from the medical record. And so these are, some of them relate to certain comorbidities or their white blood cell count, or things that you can pull from the medical record. And then others of them you may not find within the medical record, some of the social determinants, things of that nature. And so you're entering all of these, and then what it gives you once you've entered all of those variables is it will give you, at each level, it will give you a percentage likelihood of those three outcomes. What is the percentage likelihood of mortality? What is the percentage likelihood of regaining, and this is where I'm going to do it a disservice because I'm not remembering the exact details, but I think it's a baseline level of mobility within 1 year after the amputation, and then what is the risk of reamputation? So you're getting percentages for each of those levels, for the transmetatarsal level, for the transtibial level, and the transfemoral level. And then you can share those with the patient. You can say, hey, look, if they do a transmetatarsal amputation, your chance of walking again, let's say, or whatever the baseline mobility is good. It's 75% or something like that. But your risk of reamputation is extremely high, 90%, let's say. And so you allow the patient to give input and say, ooh, either let's do it, I want to walk at all costs, or, I really don't want another amputation after this first amputation. And what it isn't doing is saying that the patient just makes the decision independently. It's a conversation, and it enables information for the surgeons also, because the surgeons in the end are going to, obviously, they're going to have their own decision when it comes to the amputation level based on what they think is the likelihood of healing at a certain level of amputation. But it's going to give them additional information too, and then also with us being in our consult note saying, when discussed with the patient, they said that their priority is to not have another amputation. So then the surgeons are going to keep that in mind when they're making the decision, and so it enables more of a shared decision making rather than the sort of paternalistic old version of medicine where the patient wasn't really in the loop, and it was the clinician's decision, and the patient just went along with what the clinician decided.
Wow. Yeah, this really sounds like the future of healthcare in action. So is this powered by research data, EHR
Yes.
data, both?
Yeah, research data. Now, what's interesting is they've moved in the direction of moving to make it, from an implementation standpoint, getting back to the importance of implementation science, one of the barriers is this is challenging, or more challenging to use when you have to ask the patient a number of questions, because you have to, let's say you've done your patient visit and then you're trying to enter the information. You're like, oh man, I forgot to ask them about variable X, and then you have to go back, and clinicians are busy, so they don't like to have to, they have to move on to the next patient. So that is a barrier right there. And so they're moving in the direction of an EHR only version where it can be pulled in, where all those variables can be pulled straight from the medical record without the clinician having to do anything. And that information, then the outcomes, the probability outcomes are then there for them from the start, essentially, when they're having that visit with the patient, to be able to discuss those findings, or those probabilities, I should say. Another thing that you might be particularly interested in is where the team, myself included as a co-investigator on this team, is now moving in the direction of doing something similar for prosthesis prescription. And for looking at how does one predict mobility outcomes with different, for instance, complexity of prosthetic feet, or and so, I think that's an exciting new application of this type of research.
Yeah, absolutely. There are direct parallels there, and definitely thinking about drawing them here in this discussion. One thing we think about a lot is, ultimately the long-term vision that's kind of easy to imagine but very hard to implement is that somehow all the data would get put into a computer, and then optimal healthcare roadmap would be spit out. Many decisions to make there, and many variables to try and understand. Our piece of this, is kind of focused right now on the selection of the prosthetic foot component, and specifically we have seen the value to patients and to outcomes of being able to explore different options. So I'm preaching to the choir here, but the thinking about when, is it appropriate to take that time to trial some different options? And then over time, how do we harness that data so we can build those predictive tools someday. I don't know, these are sort of parallel, hopefully synergistic efforts that all need to evolve together.
Yeah. We actually just published an editorial on this very topic. Yes. In the archives of PM&R. In thinking about what are some of the challenges we face. So I think it all starts with understanding what is the clinical scenario. The clinical scenario is that providers, clinicians, and who are prescribing prostheses or part of that prescription team, they have to somehow figure out, if we're talking about prosthetic feet, what is the foot that has the properties that are going to best match the abilities, the goals, the priorities of each individual. And so there's no one best foot for everybody, although some manufacturers may think their foot is the best for everybody, but I don't think even the manufacturers think that. Because the feet have different trade-offs. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, but the biological human foot ankle is an incredibly versatile system, in that it can accommodate to different surfaces. It can, change stiffness on the dime. It can enable, a great amount of power for pushing off. It can enable running and jumping and all these different things that enable us as humans to do all the different things that we do. And if anyone watched the Olympics recently and think about just the role of the foot and ankle in so many of these events, it's unbelievable. Now, prosthetic feet can do certain things well, but there's no foot that comes anywhere close to the versatility of the human design. And so what that means is there's trade-offs between these different feet. And there's, a couple hundred or so feet on the market. So there's a ton to choose from with these variable designs and trade-offs in that some feet do thing X well, some feet do thing Y well, so have good energy storage and return, versus some others have good multi-axial qualities. But you have to choose, and you have to choose which one you think is going to work well for that individual, based again on your assessment of that individual. Now there's some major holes here. We don't have the objective mechanical properties of those prosthetic feet published, except in a few, different studies of some feet, but by no means anywhere close to a majority of the feet. I would say a great minority of the feet. And those objective mechanical properties are not published by manufacturers. They're not, they're not largely available. So what that means is, as clinicians, we have to say, well, based on our experience in seeing other individuals use these feet, based on, actually trying to load the feet ourselves, maybe within a socket and just pushing on them, based on maybe some manufacturer claims about their feet, we have to make a decision on what we think the properties are. And then there's no way any clinician is going to, have in the back of their mind what they think the properties of 200 different feet are. So it's a really challenging decision to make. And then a big problem is that the individual user typically does not have the opportunity to try these feet out. So this, I think gets to the crux of your question here. And it tends not really to be a shared decision-making type of scenario. Now, certainly the user is giving input in the form of, as clinicians, we're asking them questions to try and get at what we think is going to be the best foot for them. But in the typical scenario, it's not a classic shared decision-making model. And so I always like to use this analogy of, for anyone who's bought a car, you don't go to a car dealership, get asked some questions, and then them tell you what car you're going to buy. And obviously, it's not a perfect analogy, but you test drive the cars, right? You want to know what it feels like to drive that thing. And yes, you want to know, is it cool looking, and what are some of the specs and all that. But in the end, you test drive different cars and you get a sense of, does this feel like the kind of car I want to drive? Well, we don't have that opportunity, or our patients don't typically have that opportunity. And the other analogy I use is, now that I'm officially well planted in middle age, I now suddenly need glasses for the first time in my life. And so I had this experience that many of you who wear glasses have already had for years, of going to the optometrist and them using a phoropter, which essentially is a way to, quote, test drive different lenses. Yep. And it's pretty cool. You get to actually say, lens A versus lens B, which can you see better with? So you would think, well, they could just use the information just based on your eye exam, but nope, they have you actually try it out. So that's the idea behind the research that we do together, Josh, and where we collaborate, obviously, and being able to give the user the opportunity to actually try different feet out. Now, that doesn't mean that it's like a candy store or a car dealership where they get to say, "Ooh, I like foot B, so give me that one." No, it's shared decision making. So that is a useful data point for the clinician to use in that shared decision-making model. The other thing is the clinician still has to decide what are the feet they're going to try. So no individual is going to test drive 200 different feet, right? Maybe they'll test drive 3 feet, maybe only 2. So as a clinician, there's still a vitally important role for clinicians to choose, okay, what are those different feet based on the history and physical exam, based on an understanding of the individual's abilities, their goals, and their priorities. And then they get to use that data if we can implement this strategy. And obviously that can be done either with the feet themselves, which is something that I do sometimes in my clinic. There's challenges there, though. It takes extra time to switch out between feet. You have to have the feet on hand. And then there's obviously the strategy of using a system like the Humotech Caplex, where the advantage is, well, you can use a software interface to change the emulated properties of those feet to emulate the different commercial feet. And that's obviously where a lot of our research, where we've collaborated, has been over the last 8 or so years. Now, that just one more thing. So I think there's that strategy, and then there's this more predictive strategy where you use data to help predict the types of feet. And I think there's a whole line of research moving in that direction, but it's in the early phases, and there's a lot of work still to be done to categorize different feet functionally in a way that really is meaningful, to have objective data, mechanical testing data about the feet, and to put that together with what patient priorities are.
Yeah, to me, the grand challenge with these algorithmic, predictive approaches is just the massive amount of data that's going to be required, both in terms of the mechanical characteristics of the feet and also the patient outcomes with the feet. We're quite interested in supporting this effort by leveraging emulator technology. I'm curious if you, I wanted to give an example of the limb loss preservation registry, limb loss and preservation registry, sorry. This is an example of a nationwide effort to collect data and aggregate it and, perform analytics on it. I'm aware that there are other, VA-specific resources, and like I mentioned earlier, it feels like we're kind of at the dawn of this new era where these data tools are emerging and starting to be able to make useful predictions. But you and I have discussed this before. It feels like quite a challenge to, get the necessary research funded to generate the amount of data that is needed. And I'm curious, I don't know, if you could just speak to, in your day-to-day, maybe some of the challenges and opportunities around using data to inform decision-making. Because you are like in the best position imaginable. You you know about the state of the art, and you can spend a little bit of extra time, perhaps relative to the the average civilian side clinician. But yeah, the practical challenges I think are still very real for you.
Yeah. So, I mean, I gave this example of the AMPREDICT calculator, and I think the reason that has been useful and that I've used it's not because I'm collaborating with this team. It's because it is clear to me how robust the research has been and how high quality that research has been to ensure that the predictions are accurate. So, predictions are only as good as the data that's used, the questions that are asked, the types of outcomes that are considered, and so it has to be done very carefully, and it has to be really well thought out. And I think Joe Chernicke, I think when he led this he led this research for years, and he really had a vision for this from the start. Now, not everything maybe went exactly along the lines of where he thought it would definitively go, but he had a vision for the stages of research. And I think this is something that's really important for researchers and innovators to consider, is not just to do one-off things, but to really to try and develop a line of research that what are the important data elements that are going to be needed from the start? What are the stepwise processes to get that? Considerations from the start, again, of implementation science, thinking about what is going to be most useful, which also means having clinicians or ideally clinician scientists as involved in the research, and then thinking about the steps that need to be taken as you move closer and closer to implementation. Who are the stakeholders that need to be involved to ensure that implementation happens? There's a really interesting article that Atul Gawande wrote in the New Yorker years ago about, I think it was maybe 15 or so years ago at this point, but it was about why some innovations get implemented and some don't. And he uses this great example, or these two examples of, I think it was in maybe the 1850s or so, right around the same year, these two major innovations were discovered: antiseptic technique and anesthesia. So, and then he talks about why one of those innovations within, I don't know, something like a year or two was implemented, I think, throughout the world, and the other one, it took 50 years. And can you guess which took 50 years and which was innovated right away?
Well, it's not fair. I've read the article.
Oh, okay.
If you haven't, you should Google it right now and read it. It's amazing.
And spoiler alert, what it takes for something to be implemented is you have to think about the stakeholders, because antiseptic technique took a lot longer. So anesthesia made the clinician's life easier because the patient wasn't wriggling around on the OR table. I mean, I'm oversimplifying a little here, but it certainly improved outcomes also, but it made things easier. Whereas antiseptic technique, well, clearly it improves outcomes, right? Patients weren't dying of infection nearly as often, but it made things harder for the clinicians because they had to take the extra time to ensure, and especially back then, to ensure that they truly had a high quality antiseptic technique, just to wash themselves, their hands, the instruments, all those things. So I think we have to keep the stakeholders in mind if we're going to implement these innovations.
Absolutely, and collaboration is key. I've got the seed of an idea here that I'm nurturing. Comes from the feeling that you and I and the work we've been doing for the past 8 years has been super rewarding. At the same time, it feels like every year we generate more work that we need to do in order to see our shared vision realized. And I've started thinking about, how do we, start to build that sort of next level of collaboration. I don't even know what it looks like, but you know, it's got to be more than, you know, 2, 3, 4 groups collaborating. Now we need a whole symposium or a conference, you know, on whatever we want to call it, shared decision making, evidence-based methods for prosthetic selection, something like that. I think, David, maybe we should form a working group or something to start to get our colleagues who share an interest in these topics to get together.
Yeah, absolutely. I like it. One, actually, along those lines, me, along with Dan Norvell, Allison Henderson, and Beth Halsney, actually just submitted a symposium proposal to ISPO for summer of 2025 in Stockholm, along the lines of what we're talking about here. So we'll see if that gets accepted, but hopefully that will be a nice forum, and hopefully you'll be in Stockholm, Josh, and we can further these conversations along, you know, maybe at the conference and over a nice coffee in some Stockholm cafe somewhere.
Love it. Haven't been to Stockholm, so I'll put that towards the top of my list. So I wanted to go down memory lane to, you know, when we first met and started working together, because I get the question quite often, you know, how did you go about, you know, initiating this really successful collaboration with the VA? And you mentioned serendipity at the beginning of the hour here, and I usually give some version of that answer, which is true. But at the same time, I think it's been really important to both of us to be very intentional about certain things, you know, about the rigor of, you know, how the work is defined, about, you know, prioritizing teamwork, etc. So I thought it'd be interesting to ask you about how, you know, especially now, today, you're in, well, your intro was very long. You have a lot of responsibilities and many well-earned accolades. So I have to imagine you're sort of constantly presented with opportunities to work on the next big, great, awesome thing. So how do you today kind of filter out the noise and kind of choose your next step?
Yeah, it's a good question. And you're right, there's a lot of opportunities that are presented, and there has to be a choice because there's not infinite time. I think, you know, you mentioned quality and excellence. So when I'm scrutinizing potential collaborations, I'm absolutely thinking about the quality of the science, the quality of the individual that I would be collaborating with if presented with an opportunity, let's say. Or if I'm reaching out to, you know, to someone to see if they would collaborate with me. I'm thinking also a lot about in interdisciplinary teams, and as you know, I'm a huge believer in team science. I think that's how the best innovations happen, the most impactful innovations anyway, and the best research happens these days. You know, I think a lot about also, life is short, and is this someone that I'm going to work well with? And if it's not, even if it's someone who maybe, you know, has a great track record of success in you know, grant funding and publications, but if it's someone who I feel that it's not, the collaboration is not going to go well, just different approaches to science fundamentally, or, you know, fundamentally personality challenges that I'm going to have a tendency to move in a different direction and work with someone who I think we're going to work well with, because I think that will enable, in the end, not only a more enjoyable experience, but it'll enable better science, better innovations, more team-oriented approach, and that's a huge part of satisfaction in what I do for me.
Yeah, when you say team science, I think you have an interesting take on this. Sometimes really successful groups are massive in terms of headcount, and they have project managers and all sorts of staff, and that can be highly productive. At the same time, your approach has been highly productive, and you keep it quite tight knit, a small group of people who work together very closely, but then you've got this amazing ability to coordinate efforts across hundreds or thousands of miles away from your core location, which I think is really interesting, and I've got to imagine has been an advantage because regional differences I don't know, I think are a huge benefit. Diversity of opinions and cultures really helps.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, when I think about what truly brings me the greatest satisfaction in my career, I think it's actually the same thing that enables successes. It's all about relationships. Mm-hmm. It's about relationships with my patients. It's about relationships with my scientific colleagues. It's about relationships with my students, my mentees, the folks I work in leadership, in academic leadership with. And I don't say that for reasons of, I sort of hate this term networking because it feels schmaltzy to me. It feels like you're sort of using relationships for personal gain. And, and I realize that's probably not the intended use, but that's sometimes what that word feels like to me. And when I talk about relationships, I truly mean valuing those relationships to enable satisfaction, with one's work, which I think is vital and we don't talk about enough. I mean, in this age of burnout, really thriving means you have to feel satisfied with what you're doing. And a huge part of that to me is relationships, and the cultivation of relationships and the maintenance of those relationships and caring for those. And then I think it really enables, again, a higher quality when it comes down to it. And I think it is important to spend a lot of time thinking about those relationships and cultivating them. And I think that's why, I have a tendency to maybe keep a little bit more of a lean, mean operation because in the same way that, I don't know if you played Risk growing up, but if you spread your armies too thin, you're in Kamchatka and Irkutsk and, here and there, then it's not going to go well. So, you need to have some strategy and focus in developing those relationships. So I'm thinking carefully about what's the kind of expertise I need on my team. So, even though I think the collaboration between me and you started from a place in serendipity, there was a high level of quality there that I recognized in your ideas, and I appreciated the way you went about things, and I appreciated our conversations and sort of the thoughtful approach. And I think yet it still took me maybe 3 months in thinking through what we had discussed before I got back in touch with you to say, hey, I think let's move forward with this and start working on a grant. And so I think, I take my time and think carefully about who I am going to enter into these collaborative relationships with, and then I cultivate those. And so, for instance, you mentioned geographic collaboration. So working with Andy Hansen and Sarah Kohler and their team at the Minneapolis VA and now the Recover Center, that started because I already knew Andy from just some conversations and some stuff he had done in collaboration with folks here. And I knew that that was a very high quality scientist, and I knew I also liked him and liked his approach, and and that's borne out to a really fruitful collaboration, with him and his group, and obviously there's other examples of that too. So I think it's having one's antenna up for the serendipity, because you have to be open to, to conversations and ideas. So I'm always going to listen to people and hear what they have to say. And, when people bring ideas to me, I want to spend the time to really listen to them. And if I say no, it's not necessarily because I didn't like them. It may just be that doesn't fit in with my goals currently. And there is only so much time available. And, I am spread thin between my clinical care, research, teaching, mentorship, my vice chair role on the university side, things I'm doing for service for national organizations. And so I do have to be really mindful, as I know you're also very busy in your role, to be really mindful about what I take on. But those are some of the factors that I consider. And then once I'm going to take something on, then I really try and cherish that collaboration and those professional relationships.
Thanks for sharing all of that. It's solid gold, in my opinion. If you are burnt out and too busy, it's inevitable that you're going to miss that big life-changing opportunity potentially. You're going to miss the opportunity to choose it and act on it with intention. I have good days and bad days. Bad days where I just feel like I'm grinding. Though you have not explicitly mentored me, I've learned a lot from your approach, and still am befuddled at how you manage so many responsibilities with such grace. I thought it'd be good to ask you to elaborate a little bit on the mentorship piece. I am going through an interesting year of change right now, just in a lot of different domains. And I have found one of the most useful tools. One of the things I've been most grateful for is good mentorship. Some people I've met in the past year who have just really supported me and helped me, overcome obstacles. And I feel like this is not talked about enough. I feel like personally I ought to spend more time mentoring others, and perhaps less time at those schmaltzy networking events. It's a completely different type of activity. Yes.
Okay, well, let me start with, I have a lot to say about mentorship. I think it is the secret sauce. It shouldn't be a secret, and maybe it's not a secret, but it's really what I see is the key to success and satisfaction. Which, if you have success and satisfaction, what else does one need, right? Maybe a delicious dinner too, but so. My career has been built on the mentors that I've had, and I feel lucky, I feel grateful, incredibly fortunate to have received mentorship from the folks that I've received mentorship from. And I think it's worth going down memory lane for a moment and the path of just citing a few of these individuals just to express the importance of mentorship. So it goes back probably to my undergraduate days. And, I think there are those of you out there who you knew from a young age what you wanted to do. You knew you wanted to be a mechanical engineer and work in the field of prosthetics because of, some experience in younger life or just because you had more of a vision than I had. I wasn't one of those people.
Me neither.
I was not someone who, if anything, when I went to college, I thought I wanted to design mountain bikes just because I really enjoyed mountain biking. But I didn't really have a vision. And I fell into medicine actually sort of by accident. And the two classes that I took that really inspired me to go into medicine, one, not surprisingly, was my human anatomy course. And my professor was Marion Diamond, who's a neuroanatomist. And she unfortunately passed away a few years back at a very old age. I think she was in her 90s. But she taught this was at UC Berkeley, so the class size was large. I think we had 700 or so students in this class. And yet, right off the bat, she started talking about how she hated that she didn't get to know all of us as individuals. So she was going to randomly take 2 students out to lunch at the faculty club every week. And that only still didn't allow her to get to know most of the folks. So she also, at the time she was in her 70s, she also played basketball at 6 a.m. on the courts on Hurst Street on the north side of campus on Wednesdays. Anyone was welcome to join. So of course I went, and I had these conversations with her. And by the way, she was throwing elbows, and she was just so full of life. So I ended up having a lot of conversations with her, and I was completely inspired by the way she taught anatomy. And it was all about form-fitting function. And I would say she was maybe my first true mentor in science. Now, the surprise is that the other course that really inspired me to go into medicine was an American history course. It was taught by a professor named Leon Litwack. And he really focused on the stories of human experience, especially from the folks whose stories are less often told. So, the masses of society rather than the aristocracy, that type of thing. And he used a lot of primary source material. And I was really also inspired by his approach. But I think I've always loved stories, but I fell in love with this concept of human stories and how one could possibly impact human stories. So I had these 2 different professor mentors, one from anatomy, one from sort of human experiential stories. And I put that together, and it seemed to go towards medicine as a career. Then I thought, well, if I'm going to try and get into medical school, I need to work in a lab, because that's what it seems like people do. So again, serendipity, I ended up running into someone on campus who said, I'm leaving this lab and they need another undergrad to work there. And it turns out it was the biomechanics lab led by Claire Farley and Roger Crom. And so for you biomechanics listeners out there, you probably are well familiar with these important scientists in our field. And so I just, through serendipity, happened to work in their lab at UC Berkeley. And Claire was my primary mentor. And she was a fantastic mentor that got me really excited about biomechanics. Again, the story is I did not have a vision. Things happened. But my radar, my antenna was up, and I could tell that these were all quality individuals. So then moving on to medicine, I finally found PM&R, went into that field, and then in my PM&R residency, Joe Chernicke became my mentor. And then, and Joe was just an incredible physician scientist who was a fantastic mentor. We would meet for like 2 to 3 hours a week, and we would just get deep into these scientific and clinical conversations. And Joe was never one to abruptly end. If we were going to dive into some science, man, we were going to go there. And Joe really inspired me to really think deeply about these issues and to go into this particular field. And then Mike Boninger was an important mentor who is in your neck of the woods in Pittsburgh, he's the former chair at University of Pittsburgh PM&R department, and now he's had all these different important roles at the School of Medicine and the university at Pitt. Mike's also a fantastic mentor, fantastic physician, scientist, and leader, and really inspired me in many of those ways. So my career was built from having not only these mentors who were exceptional at what they did, but who also really invested a lot of time in me. And that also inspired me to think, I need to do that as a scientist. As I've achieved certain levels of success in my career, I need to be that person to others now. Now, I can't do it for, a huge number of people because that would spread me too thin. So again, it's this choosing fairly carefully where there's going to be good matches. And I've been incredibly fortunate to have mentees like Beth Halsney, who I've now been working with for years, And, I started off when she was a graduate student mentoring her. And, she is now well beyond that. She got her master's in mechanical engineering, her PhD in rehab science, and now she's an investigator at Climb. And she is working towards a career development award, doing some of the same research that we've talked about in this direction of shared decision making, and is doing fantastic work. And so that's just an example of, again, cultivating these relationships over time. And in my vice chair role on the university side, I mentor a lot of our junior faculty, and I really try and, as much as I can, be that mentor that all these great mentors were to me, that were incredibly influential in my career. And I count, many of my successes, I really count as their successes because of the ways they inspired me and all the things that they taught me. So, it's an incredibly satisfying part of one's career, being mentored and mentoring.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing, David. It's definitely resulting in a personal call to action for me. I want to, maybe this is a thinking over the Christmas holiday sort of activity, how I can put mentorship more front and center in 2025. We're actually over time. This has been such a great discussion. Thank you, David. I wanted to just close by asking you, for a call to action for our listeners. There've been so many great calls to action peppered throughout this, but this is the one part of the script that I like to end on, and I bet you have something in mind.
Yeah.
So specifically around, I'd like you to think about the innovators in the audience wanting to increase their impact on clinical care.
Yeah, great question. And Josh, I will say it has been a pleasure, and it's always a pleasure to get a chance to talk, to philosophize, pontificate with you, and get into these details. So really enjoying it, and enjoyed the conversation. So the call to action, and maybe these are at the risk of repeating a few things. I think thinking carefully about team science and relationships is absolutely vital for the innovators. I think I've benefited tremendously from working with engineers like yourself, like Andy Hansen, and a multitude of others. And as someone who is not an engineer, but is a clinician scientist, I couldn't do this research without you and other engineers. But I'd like for especially the engineers in the audience who are listening to think about that from the flip side of, as engineers, you have a great ability to think about device innovation, but you probably don't have the experience to really understand what the true problems are in the clinical setting and what some of the implementation challenges may be to having your innovations be implemented in the clinical setting. And I think, the name of the game is having a positive impact. I think we all do this because we want to improve the lives of others. And we want to innovate in a way that's going to be meaningful for people and it's going to help improve their lives. So going back to Leon Litwack and my American history professor, and helping to positively shape those human stories, and on a large scale too. And so think about those elements of what you need on a team, and think about what's the input you're going to need that's really going to enable the innovations to move in a direction where they're truly going to be impactful, where they're going to truly accomplish and overcome a clinical barrier, a clinical problem, and where they're going to be implementable. So think about who are those key members of the team, and then cultivate those relationships. So maybe a little boring because I was repeating some things I already said, but I really think those are some of the keys to the call to action, to enabling good innovation. And then give yourself time. Everyone's busy, but take a walk in the woods and just think. carve out the time. You have to prioritize the time to really develop the good ideas, and then think through who you need on that team to develop those with you.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. For me personally, as a mechanical engineer, it was really intuitive to think about potential solutions that took the form of a device. But it took me a long time to think outside the box about solutions that might not be device-centric. And that came from the relationship building. So, yeah, that resonates with me very nicely. Well, thank you, David. Really appreciate your time and enjoyed talking with you.
It was a pleasure, Josh.